when the left can't get what it wants based on the argument about the substance itself, by trying to say, this is a good guy, we need this illegal El Salvadorian immigrant in America, he's doing wonderful things here, they can't win any of those arguments. They would lose in the court of public opinion. So instead they're saying, no, it's not about that, it's about habeas corpus, it's about the rule of law, it's about the Supreme Court. They're very smart because they know that, these things, the rule of law, habeas corpus, Supreme Court, these are much stronger things to hide behind.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sitdown, but before we get to the interview, we'd love it if you'd hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review because we love your feedback. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works and how to affect real change. Without further ado, here's the interview. Daniel McCarthy, welcome to the Signal Sitdown.
Thank you, Bradley. Delighted to be here.
Last week, we had Rod Dreher on the show talking about his new series with Angel Studios about his book, Live Not by Lies. And you might not know at home that I was actually on my honeymoon, a belated honeymoon because we got married right before the election. I needed to be back in Washington to cover it. But I missed my last day of work 2 weeks ago was Liberation Day. So I missed a lot in a week, and I couldn't think of someone better to talk about the last week and a half of news than you, Dan, the editor of Modern Age, publication of ISI. First off, you're all over the place. Of course, your column is in our pages at the Daily Signal, but it can be found almost in every local and national newspaper around the country. Tell us, how did you get into this space? How did you get to where you are now?
Well, my background as a conservative goes back to the days when I was in high school and then when I was in college. This is the late 90s, mid 90s, and I was a great fan of Pat Buchanan. So in many respects, I have been interested in the kinds of issues that Trump is now championing for, going back 30 plus years. And my first job in Washington, D.C. was working at the American Conservative magazine, and I eventually became the editor-in-chief of that publication. So this is a space I've been in terms of right-wing populism, talking about trade, immigration, foreign policy, sometimes, in environments where you had more of a George W. Bush or neoconservative kind of background for the conservative movement. So I've seen a lot of changes in Washington from the days when my views were very unpopular to a time now when Donald Trump is kind of leading the entire right in the direction that I think is the correct direction.
Mm-hmm. And let's talk about the ascendancy of those particular issues. Immigration, trade, foreign policy. As we are finding, it is very difficult to usher in a new era or a new way of thinking with just how entrenched it seems the neoliberal order is in whether that's the financial system or that's our trading system or that's just the way that people go about their business. It's a monumental task in front of the Trump administration, and they've moved vigorously in the first 86 days of the presidency. We're recording this on Wednesday. Last week was a major attempt at that type of reorganization. As I said, my last day was Liberation Day. We had big poster boards in the Rose Garden about all these different types of reciprocal tariffs. And then bond yield curves move in a direction that folks did not expect. President moves away from those types of tariffs, puts on pauses, leaves a general tariff in place. I mean, what do you make of the difficulty that the Trump administration is having in reorienting the trading system?
Well, it doesn't surprise me in that we've had what you referred to as kind of a neoliberal trade order for more than 30 years now, and you're not going to be able to change that overnight. Now, the Trump administration wanted to make the most drastic change possible as quickly as possible, maybe in part to see what the reaction would be. But beyond that, also just to send the strongest possible signal to companies both in this country and around the world that jobs should be brought back to America, manufacturing should be brought back to America, whether or not there are tariffs, because even if the tariffs are suspended, as they are right now in many cases, there is still going to be the potential that they will be brought back at any time. And so I think the Trump administration has picked a very big fight, of course, but one that it expected, one that it knew was going to be very difficult. And the president, he's very confident. Not only has he been reelected, not only has he been acquitted, in the court of public opinion and at the ballot box of all the lawfare that was waged against him last year, but he's also survived attempts on his life. So the president is now thinking, I believe, on a much larger vista than that of simply, what's happening to the stock market, what's happening to the bond market at a particular moment. He has, you know, uh, one wants to be humble here, but he has a mission from on high, more or less, to try to change things in America for the better. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that every move he makes is going to be successful. And, the administration clearly took the feedback they were getting from the markets and from public opinion and said, well, maybe we need to be a little more gradualistic about this. Maybe we need to have some give and take rather than trying to implement everything all at once. But I think the president has sort of two paths to success here, and you'll see that many of his critics are very frustrated by that, and they don't like it. They want to say that there's a contradiction here, but in fact, the president can either go all in, trying to, change the world order with respect to trade completely, so that you have much more trade taking place within nations rather than between them, especially in the United States, using trade barriers, using tariffs. That would be a very different kind of economy than we've had in the last 30 years, maybe a very different economy than we've had since, about a century ago with the New Deal. Trump could try to do that. And capitalism will adjust, markets will adjust. Basically, you'd have a change in incentives, and people would be, have a reason to invest in domestic production. And you could have, a kind of golden age, a new efflorescence of American production here in this country. That's not to say that things would look exactly like they did 100 years ago or anything like that, but there would be obviously huge changes relative to the more global era that we've been in more recently. So that's one path that Trump could take, and that would be it would be so different from what we've known in recent decades that it would even be hard to compare like apples to oranges here. It would simply be a completely new economic arrangement. It would still be free market, but it would be free market within a country rather than as extensively between countries. The other path to success, however, is where Trump could simply say, look, this is a goal that we could go towards, and it would obviously involve a lot of disruption in the meantime. If you don't want that, whether you're, leaders in foreign countries or whether you're companies either in America or elsewhere, if you want to, salvage something that is more of a global system, but not as globalized as what we've seen since the 1990s, if you want to save the system, you're going to have to cooperate and cut a deal and basically make sure that we have a system which may be highly internationalized, but actually does preserve a great deal of manufacturing and production here in America. So that's the second approach to success: is to have a more negotiated approach rather than simply, a kind of complete, redesigning of the limits of international trade.
Well, and this is where I think the strategic communications aspect of the administration, right? That the world that kind of we operate in a certain sense as folks of letters, of media, and the strategic policy world really intersect. You can see the nexus like very clearly with the trade issue. And the first thing I would say about it is there are pro tariff proponents. There would be there. It's another thing if it's an anti tariff proponent. They don't want tariffs at all. But pro tariff proponents saying in order to minimize your downside risk, you need to give a larger runway for these tariffs when they are enacted. So, why is that? Well, if you announce a tariff of 25% 18 months from now or 12 months from now, then you give the markets time to create those different supply lines. I remember during COVID, when we couldn't get our hands on hand sanitizer, that a lot of distilleries started making hand sanitizer here in the United States, right? So that similar thing can happen over a period of time. Now, for hand sanitizer, it took a period of months. For, let's just say, steel, it's going to take a longer period of time, higher capital expenditures, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's that argument, right? So that's where the communication strategy of the policy is paired with the policy's rollout. Then there are others who say we can't slow roll this thing because as soon as you try to do that, and I believe Treasury Secretary Besant has said something similar to this, as soon as you try to slow roll something like this, the markets are going to act how they want to act anyway, as if you didn't give them, as if you didn't give them a runway, and you're going to run into a situation where special interests are going to try to gobble up the entire thing. So you just need to do it immediately. Um, what do you make of those two arguments? A longer runway versus the immediacy, which is ultimately the plan that the administration went forward with, which was we're going to have this thing called Liberation Day, and you're not necessarily going to know what's going to be involved.
Yeah, I think, the point you raised about a more incremental approach is correct because if you're going to replace foreign goods with domestic goods, which is, what the Trump administration would ultimately like to see happen, you're going to have to deal with the realities of what those production chains require, especially with, big ticket items like steel, but any number even of consumer goods cannot be manufactured in America just overnight. You can't build factories, in 24 hours. And if you have a limitation on foreign trade before you've been able to build up your capacity domestically, then you will get a price shock, and that will be something that consumers will be very unhappy with. And you may see inflation. You certainly will see, even in anticipation of that, a lot of violence, so to speak, within the markets.
Mhm.
And that's exactly what we did see. Now, the argument from the other side would say, well, that may be true, and you're going to have these disruptions, but if you don't start, to the maximum extent possible right away, then people are not going to have the same sense of urgency, and you may very well have, uh, it's like any problem. If you have to, deal with something difficult, it's better to deal with it right away, completely, rather than trying to parcel it out and risk extenuating it and simply becoming accustomed to suboptimal arrangements.
Mhm.
Um, so, the Trump administration, by the way, if you were looking at a conventional administration, whether Republican or Democrat, you would probably judge its success simply by the state of the stock market or the bond market. Those very conventional metrics would be what people would use correctly to judge, how's the administration doing, because that's what administrations, other than this one, primarily care about. The Trump administration, on the other hand, it really does have a much bigger vision, and I've actually compared Donald Trump not, in a sense that I approve of Franklin Roosevelt, far from it, but I think the magnitude of what Trump's trying to do is comparable to someone like Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. I mean, this really is a matter of saying something has fundamentally gone awry with the American economy, and government has a role in helping to correct that mistake.
This is the Main Street Wall Street differentiation that we talk about so
Yeah,
frequently, but I think people misunderstand that, right? Like you see it geographically, you see it in your hometown, right? Your hometown is not financialized. A lot of, let's say, places, storefronts on your main street might be closed, and so at the same time, Wall Street has gained major profits, but um,
well,
that's not a symbol of the overall health of the economy, right? So
absolutely.
like small business confidence or real working wages or consumer confidence for people below a certain income threshold. Those are the type of metrics that the Trump administration is focusing on. There's, of course, the inflation question, right? CPI. Of course, the Trump administration is paying close attention to CPI. There's other indices, right? There's oh gosh, I forget who created it, but it's like the average Joe index, which basically accounts for the fact that the lower 75% of the country's income earners are consuming a different
Mm.
basket of goods, and the CPI is accounting for 100% of income earners in the United States, and that because the high end of the income distribution consumes so much, it actually changes the basket of
Mhm.
goods. And so if you're looking at, you know, a, let's say, 0.5% increase in the CPI above expectations, well, that's bad. But what's the average Joe index doing? Is the average Joe index growing at a rate that's only 0.2%? Is it actually falling? These are all things that the Trump administration is focusing on rather than whether or not line go up or line go down for the S&P or for the Dow.
I think that's right. But also, if you are, bringing about major changes, you're going to change the metrics as well,
Mhm.
even the ones that are unconventional, like the average Joe price index. And obviously, there is good reason to pay close attention to what's happening in prices in the supermarket. Now, we saw a lot of hype earlier this year about the price of eggs. That had a lot to do with avian flu, the fact we were destroying birds, we were destroying eggs. Um, but Americans go to the supermarket and they simply judge, is the price of the basket of produce and meat and snacks and whatever they're buying, is that going up or down? And then they judge an administration based on that. But Trump, of course, this is his second term. He, likes to tease the left by talking about the possibility of a third term. Um, but, he, is not running for reelection right now. He's already been reelected and he's got a very strong hand in Washington. So he's in a position of being able to follow what he thinks is the best course of action without being hypersensitive to the polls. And in a way, the left and the Democrats have themselves to blame for this, because normally when you have two successive terms, and of course Trump is like Grover Cleveland in being a two-term president who has an interruption in the middle. But normally when you have two successive terms, the mentality of the first term will carry over to some degree in the second term. The second term becomes a little bit complacent. People think they're all accustomed to what's been happening. With Trump, because of that interregnum with Joe Biden or whoever was actually running the country at that point, there is instead, this sense that, Trump could sit back, think about what worked and what didn't work in the first term, and then come into a second term with a new plan. And so I think progressives here, they're often trying to judge the Trump administration by the same standards that they're accustomed to with other administrations. And like I say, Trump just isn't that fixated on the price of stocks or of bonds, which is not to say that he's completely ignoring them either.
Right. He loves to brag about them.
Yeah.
But is that the actual metric that he's looking at in the Oval Office when he's talking to Scott Bessent, or he's talking to other members of the administration, Kelly Loeffler, et cetera, et cetera? I want to return to the mentality of this Trump administration 2.0, but I want to go back to, we talked a little bit about the nexus between strategic communication and strategic policy in the rollout of the tariffs, but it's a place where you can see the importance of that nexus. At the same time, there's a hidden aspect of this. So if I were to explain the Trump tariff situation as it stands now, I would say there's 3, maybe 4 verticals of what the Trump administration is trying to accomplish. The first vertical is earn revenue for the United States government, right? Tariff as a revenue collection mechanism. The second vertical, using tariffs as leverage to decrease trade barriers. The third vertical would be the national security implications. This is China. We could just call it the China vertical if you'd like, but there's of course other national security considerations in other countries. And then the fourth vertical is interesting because we'll call it the free speech vertical. JD Vance has talked a lot about this, using American market power in order to make sure the West stays true to its values, right? If Europe wants America to be the leader of the free world, which they were in such dismay that there might have to be a new leader of the free world. If Europe wants the United States to continue to be the leader of the free world, then don't be surprised when the United States knocks on your door and you're the UK government or the Starmer government and says, "Excuse me, Mr. Starmer, why are you giving harsher prison sentences for the same crime to white people rather than to people of color?" Right. So we can call those the 4 verticals. The problem with the strategic communications aspect is you can't actually communicate how those verticals are interacting with one another. And that's why I think a lot of people have said that they are confused about the way that the administration is talking about it. Chamath on the All In podcast has compared this tariff situation to a game of poker, right? So in Texas Hold'em, there's the flop, you take a set of actions, there's the river, there's the turn, another round of betting, and of course the river, and that's when you settle things up. You don't know, like let's say on Liberation Day, a 70% tariff on Cambodia was supposed to be a revenue generating mechanism at the start. But then the Cambodian government comes in and says, well, we want to really negotiate more favorable terms. So what starts off as a revenue generating mechanism shifts to a shifts to the vertical where you're trying to lower tariff barriers, you're trying to lower trade barriers. And so these things all get braided together.
Yeah.
And you can't, like, you don't tell everybody at the poker table
Well, and it,
how your hand improved when more information was presented to you.
well, and it
That's
really
not a smart bet.
exactly, and it really frustrates ideologues and not just ideologues, but also people who are locked into conventional modes of thinking, even if they, are simply doing it because that's the way they were trained in college. They don't like that sort of fluidity. They don't like that process of discovery. They don't like trial and error. They want to believe, in policies that are either all or nothing. And the Trump administration is taking a radically different approach. It's saying, actually, we're going to try these things out. We're going to then take the new information that's generated based on what cards we're holding and what cards we're playing and how the bluffs are turning out. And we're going to adjust based on that. And it's not that there are, no risks with what Trump's doing. Obviously, there are a great many risks. And, the biggest risk of all is that you could wind up with the worst of both worlds. So if you, want to create a very different kind of manufacturing base, for example, in America, and you only get halfway there, and you don't have the benefits of a completely reshored manufacturing base, but you've also lost the benefits of America having the reserve currency, for example, of the world. That would be a terrible, terrible situation.
Mm.
So, there definitely are dangers to Trump's approach. On the other hand, America has, in terms of wealth, in terms of leverage over the world, it's got a very strong hand, and it hasn't been playing that hand very well up to now because the presidents and the administrations who have been making America's trade policies have been ideologically and otherwise intellectually locked into frameworks that are not about America first, not about America's interest, and not even about taking in new information and then changing your approach based on that information, but rather that have said, well, this is the textbook way of doing things. We cannot deviate from it. This is what our ideology tells us is the end of history and is going to create maximum not just prosperity but liberty for the whole planet. And therefore, we're never going to take any kind of negative data coming to us from Main Street, coming to us from the shutdown of so many American factories, so many American small towns. We're just going to ignore that data, ignore the pain of the voters, and proceed with this globalization agenda. And of course, if we didn't have elections, they could have gotten away with it. We do have elections. There's a reason not only Trump, but the Republicans in general have been doing much better than the Democrats recently. The American people have said, no, wait a minute, we do not want to be on this, unquestionable globalist track. Instead, we have to have some attempt, at redressing the balance between the world and the nation state. And in particular, the components of America, our states and our localities. So that's what Trump's doing. And obviously, if you're breaking away from something that is a complete image constructed by ideologues and people who are, sort of immune to feedback information, if you're going to do that, then you're obviously not only going to confuse and perplex all the people who do have that straightforward ideological approach, but you're also going to, you're just going to be much more fluid, much more experimental than your critics are going to, even be capable of imagining. And that's what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, I think we've laid out, all the different struggles and pitfalls of the strategy. Whether that's on the rollout side, the communication side, right? You just can't be fully transparent all the time about this thing. I think Trump has been fairly transparent about his tariff policy, but it's against the nature of the negotiations
Right.
that they're trying to accomplish to be fully transparent at all times.
And I would say,
Because if you're transparent to the American people about, like, the Cambodian tariffs are meant to generate revenue, and then all of a sudden the Cambodians come to the table and you switch, well, then you're accused by the media of being a flip-flop or of this, that, and the other thing. And you have to be able to, you have to have that flexibility built in, because
Right.
that is the purpose of the negotiation. We think about this, you and I are very much on the restraint side of foreign policy. We don't get mad every single time the DOD or the president comes out and says all options are on the table. We know that that's like a necessary aspect of statecraft. Whatever conversations are happening between Steve Witkoff and the Iranians, like, the Iranians are probably aware of what's on the table for them. But does that mean that that's the privy of the entire world? No. I mean, this is the balance between a transparent um, uh, y- populist asterisk executive, right? The executive as the only representative in our government elected by the entirety of the American population, and the necessary qualities of the executive, which is the secrecy and dispatch.
Yeah, I
Um,
would say, you know, I agree with that. And certainly, you know, to go back to your poker analogy, you don't flash your cards to the entire room, you
it's
know,
the best
when you're trying to
analogy.
play the game.
Yeah.
But I will say, you know,
And you can also play it competitively with friends. And I think that's another thing where the Biden administration
right.
treated alliances as sacrosanct. And so we sat around the poker table as if we were the adult and were playing with little children,
Well, and
right?
you
You let the
also
children win the
right,
board game.
and you don't do your friends any services by, you know, treating them like that, allowing them to be complacent. You actually want them to be smart and competitive, and that's what we're trying to encourage here. And by the way, I think Vice President Vance, in some of his interviews with Sorba Mari, for example, in Unheard, one of the
Mhm.
British publications, has been bringing this out and says actually we want to have, you know, a closer perhaps trading relationship with the UK. But in order to do that, we just have to understand one another much better, and we have to work on this. I will say, I think maybe the one sort of nuance I would add to your remarks is, um, you know, I don't think we should look at this as entirely being, oh, there's a secret master plan that's fully developed, and you know, the success or failure of what Trump's doing
That's
is
right.
based upon some, you know, blueprint that is, and you know, I think critics would try to take your remarks and spin them and say, ah, well, Trump is not playing honest with the American people. He's got this secret plan that he's not telling them about, and you know, maybe it's failing, and you know, it's all completely worked out, and it either has to completely succeed or completely fail. And I think your poker analogy is actually much better, and that in fact, you know, in a weird way, you know, some of the people who are most upset about the Trump administration are admirers of Friedrich Hayek. But Friedrich Hayek is about, you know, these kinds of information exchanges, discoveries, and experiments. And you know, there are risks, of course, in saying that government can also be entrepreneurial. Government can also take risks. Government can also employ feedback mechanisms and take information and change its approach based on that. But in a way, that's actually what Trump's doing. So that's a component of it.
Mhm.
You're right. He has a sketch. He knows, you know, kind of in general. And you're right. Those verticals that you've described are things that he knows can be accomplished. He knows that there are certain trade-offs among them as well. That, you know, maybe you can't do 100% on all four of them, but you can, you know, you have to make a judgment call as to, you know, how important is it to have, you know, whatever manufacturing is in Cambodia come to America versus having, you know, very inexpensive Cambodian goods, but with more manufacturing than presently exists, you know, coming from Cambodia to America. You can strike a balance between those things. You don't have to say it has to be 100% one way or the other, unless, of course, you're an ideologue and you're saying all of this is simply an abstract question, is not a question for prudence and negotiation. So I think all these layers of complexity are actually very healthy. And this is
Mhm.
exactly what statesmanship is all about. And you're quite right to allude to it, both in foreign policy and also in trade policy. You want leaders who are going to engage in these processes of discovery, who are going to engage in negotiations, and who are not simply going to say, you know what, I've got a dogmatic view of something, and I'm going to stick to it no matter what, even if it winds up leading us into the crises that we've basically come to on immigration, on trade policy, and in foreign policy over the last 30 odd years under both Republicans and Democrats, who were locked into policies that had severely negative repercussions that were never priced into the leadership that was being provided by the establishment.
Right. And those are the two kind of, as we talk about the neoliberal ideology that entrenched, you know, the Clinton, Bush, Obama administration, et cetera, right? There's that. And then, you know, critics of Trump will say, well, you know, okay, the master plan can either be it's either ideological or it's this, you know, uh, they will liken it to, because they're critics of the Hungarian government as well. Like, this is just Viktor Orban come to sit in Washington, D.C. And yeah, you're exactly right to point out that I'm not saying that there is a master plan. It's not an Ocean's movie. That's not what we're dealing with. We're
Mhm.
not dealing with breaking into the Bellagio vault here, um, where we need 13 guys and guys at a dice factory in Mexico and all this stuff. It's one of my favorite movies. It's not that. What it is knowing that there are certain incentive structures in
Mhm.
play and using those incentive structures to ultimately benefit the American people, and not knowing exactly where all the cards are going to fall
Mhm.
at all times, but knowing that, you know, you can trust your adversaries or your allies' incentives. right? You can trust their self-interest to a certain degree. That doesn't mean that you should force them to pursue it contra your own interest, right? Which we see a little bit in the Canadian question,
Mhm.
not with much respect to trade, but with respect to the domestic situation going on in Canada right now, where it looks like Carney has a stronger hand, and Pierre Poilievre is kind of struggling to balance Trump, his likeness with Trump in a way, and his Canada first messaging. Um, all that is to say, right, it's not a master plan, but you can see if you are prudent in your actions on the front end and discerning about your future actions where these things are going to naturally lead. And that's the type of stewardship that you want to see in a good statesman. And you mentioned this before, the mentality of Trump 2.0, sitting in Mar-a-Lago basically with a shadow government for 4 years, seeing how the Biden administration was going awry, courting, building this brand new coalition that is uh, difficult to kind of put your arms around in a way, but at the same time has made this administration, as you said, much more fluid, much more dynamic. Um, this mentality of Trump 2.0, um, what changed? What has been uh, the administration's modus operandi?
Well, typically the first time a president is elected in a first term, they will draw upon the talent pool that has been created by previous administrations in their party. And if not administrations, then perhaps by Congress, by the RNC or the DNC, by existing networks. And that's what Trump did basically in his first term. Now, he partly did that, and then he partly brought in complete outsiders, people like Rex Tillerson, for example, as Secretary of State. And it turned out that there were downsides, very strong downsides to both of those approaches. The outsiders often had no idea what they were doing and couldn't operate effectively within Washington, whereas the insiders, they knew all too well what they were doing and knew very well how to operate effectively in Washington for purposes that were contrary to the president's and contrary to those of his voters. So those were some of the difficulties the first Trump administration ran into. And obviously, we saw the permanent bureaucracy in Washington, D.C., constantly leaking and trying to subvert not just the president, but the Constitution itself. The Constitution says the president is in charge of the executive branch. The this blob of expertise and permanent bureaucrats in Washington D.C. They believe no, the executive branch is actually this permanent thing which is not answerable to elections. It is not under the president. It is in fact a entrenched bureaucracy of experts who don't have to answer to public opinion and who really don't have to answer to anyone for anything that happens. They've got career civil service protections. And these, folks worked against the Trump administration and were a source of a barrier to the aims for which Trump was elected in the first place. And so, and if there had been a direct continuation from Trump 1 to Trump 2, the momentum of Trump 1, which in some ways was a stalled momentum or a slowed momentum, would have carried over into that second term. And it would have been hard to fire everyone, both the political appointees and certainly the non political appointees, and to say, okay, we need to kind of strip the whole machine down, rebuild it from the ground up, and see why it was running so poorly. But because we've had this interregnum with Joe Biden, Trump came to office, the second time, saying this is a chance for a completely fresh start.
Mhm.
We're not going to have just time-serving Republicans, people who have just, been, with no particular philosophical commitment, who've just been party hacks for a long time. We're not going to defer to them. We're not going to pack the administration with them. We're not going to defer to the permanent bureaucracy. We're going to actually have the constitutionally elected head of the executive branch is going to make the decisions for the entire executive branch, including the civil service as well as the political appointees. That change, where you're actually trying to implement, and that's the great thing. Trump's critics, as much as his supporters, should stop and say, "Wait a minute. Trump told us he was going to do all of this. Trump said,
Mhm.
we're going to change trade policy. We're going to really crack down on immigration. We're going to have a different America First foreign policy." All of this was advertised on the campaign trail. The American people knew what they were getting, and they wanted it. They voted for it. And the honest thing to do is for Trump to give the people what he was offering them. And that's exactly what he's doing. And of course, that is rather unprecedented in recent decades in Washington, where everyone understands, well, yes, you tell the people one thing, but once you're elected, you kind of, go back to doing whatever the Washington establishment wants you to do. Trump is saying, no, we're actually going to do what I campaigned on, what I've thought is the right thing to do, and what the American people elected me to do.
Yeah, and one of those areas in particular is immigration. And this is the sacred cow that Trump has slaughtered in no small thanks to Joe Biden because of 12 million to 22 million illegal migrants entering the United States, some with illegal waves of the wand from the executive to grant some sort of status, others just the old fashioned illegal way. Um, that is the sacred cow he has slaughtered. And now, because the capacity for the permanent class of bureaucrats has been weakened by what Doge is doing and what the administration is doing, there are others, namely in the judicial branch, that are trying to take up that mantle. No surprise to me, understanding how our Constitution is set up and how it works, that the executive and the judiciary are going to be fighting vigorously with one another, especially with the powers that the judiciary has claimed for itself over the past 150 years. Nevertheless, here we are, and we just had a story come out that says a district court believes it has jurisdiction over an El Salvadorian citizen in El Salvador. I mean, this has to be a gift to the Trump administration in a way, because the Trump administration has been making this argument since district court judges have been issuing injunction after injunction on the president's 100-day agenda. This has to be a gift to them because this is so far beyond the pale.
Right. So you had someone who came to the United States as an illegal immigrant. He was not in the country lawfully. Um, Various investigations found that this was a member of MS-13, the El Salvadorian gang, very vicious and violent, and said, "Well, this guy is a no good Nick. He shouldn't be in this country." But this individual said, "Well, I could face persecution if I'm sent back to El Salvador." So judges were willing to give him a certain stay to sort out these questions. The Trump administration said, We're not going to play these games. We're going to simply send him back to El Salvador. He's an El Salvadorian citizen. You're sending him back home to his own country, to his own, country's judicial system, to its, law enforcement system." And now you have, progressives saying, "Well, this was done wrongfully." You've had judges say that, well, the president should have, given this guy more hearings. He was, not given due, process rights. And this is a problem. And now you've got a judge even saying, well, you've got to somehow bring him back to the country. Well, wait a minute. How can the American president or an American court claim to now, tell El Salvador what it can do with a citizen of El Salvador within El Salvador?
Mhm.
Just doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, it's one thing to say, did the administration follow due process correctly? And maybe not. The Supreme Court, by a 9-0 ruling, said they sided with the lower courts, which had said, okay, he didn't get due process correctly. So that's a legal question. But now there's the practical question of, well, again, you've got an El Salvadorian citizen in El Salvador, subject to El Salvador's laws. This is no longer something that either an American executive branch or an American judiciary has any determinative say over.
Mhm.
So that's one thing that's kind of ridiculous. But of course, what is really the issue here isn't so much the process, which it's very interesting because we see this a lot where when the left can't get what it wants based on the argument about the substance itself, by trying to say, this is a good guy, we need this illegal El Salvadorian immigrant in America, he's doing wonderful things here, they can't win any of those arguments. They would lose in the court of public opinion. So instead they're saying, no, it's not about that. It's about habeas corpus. It's about the rule of law. It's about the Supreme Court. They're very smart because they know that these things, the rule of law, habeas corpus, Supreme Court, these are much stronger things to hide behind. And the Trump administration is taking a risk here. It's saying, you know what? We're not even going to let you hide behind those things. We're going to say, okay, maybe the Supreme Court says we made a mistake, but you know what? The fact this guy was in the country originally, is the bigger mistake. The
Mhm.
fact that we've had, these open border policies, basically the Biden administration policies, that was a far bigger mistake than anything this administration has done. And the American people get to decide, in the midterm elections and in public opinion polls right now, which side they think is correct about, who's making the greater error here if there are errors being made. So Trump is fighting these battles, and of course, the left has this completely warped view of the judiciary. They want to say that the judiciary was created within the Constitution as the final arbiter of what happens in the country and in the Constitution itself. And they have a fundamentally unconstitutional view because, as you said, the actual institutions of the Constitution are set up so there will be conflict. And that's the whole point, actually, is that's what the separation of powers is often about. That the executive has its view, the judiciary has its view, and Congress has its.
Every single one of them necessitates interpreting the Constitution.
Absolutely.
It's
And they're
most
all,
directly seen with the judiciary, but if you are going to craft a law, you have to know something about the Constitution and what it means. If you're a legislator, if you're going to enforce the laws that are built upon the constitutional basis, you have to have an understanding of what the Constitution is and what it does. And so all of these players, whether you're individual congressmen or Congress as a whole, the executive or members of the cabinet, and of course the judiciary at all levels, they're all simultaneously interpreting the Constitution, and there will be disagreements about it.
and they're all self-interested.
And they're all
And
self-interested.
by the way, that's not, James Madison and the founding fathers, the framers of the Constitution, they planned for that. They expected the institutions to be self-interested. And in fact, the bigger problem we have in America right now is the fact that Congress has taken a view of its self-interest, which is not exerting its proper constitutional powers, but rather is trying to defer to the other branches, both the judiciary and especially the permanent executive, not the constitutional presidential executive, but this weird hybrid thing which somehow has legislative and executive and judicial powers. This permanent deep state in Washington. Congress has said, well, wait a minute, if we actually do our job and try to pass budgets and try to legislate, that might make us unpopular, and we don't want to do that. We want to be popular. We just want to grandstand and just talk. And so we're happy to give actual governing power to this completely unconstitutional entity that exists, in the federal bureaucracy.
And let's talk about the Congress real quick, because we're 86 days into Trump's first 100 days. Trump has signed 4 pieces of legislation. He's issued more than 100 executive orders. 4 pieces of legislation he signed, Lake and Riley Act. I think that was a big win for everybody involved. Second piece of legislation was the CR. And then, of course, you had 2 CRAs.
Mhm.
So very small on the legislative front. Of course, there's going to be one big, beautiful bill we've been promised that's going to deliver on the MAGA agenda in Congress through budget reconciliation. Nevertheless, that is not the historical norm. Is this, I think both you and I want to see a more assertive Congress, a Congress that actually protects over its powers and wields them properly. But is this Trump taking on more power to the executive for himself, or is this Trump realizing that the modern presidency is built that way? Is he inheriting all of this, or is he building upon it?
It's a bit of both, but I think what's important here is that we're getting back to the real substance of the Constitution, which is precisely in these conflicts between the branches and the fact that they are separate and distinct. What you had up till now was this, a kind of series of illusions that was propagated in public high schools, propagated oftentimes in law schools, throughout the country, and propagated by the media. Basically, having this completely, made up view saying that you have this completely independent executive branch, which somehow is equal to or superior to the elected president. That the Supreme Court is the final word on the Constitution, and the other branches don't even get a say. That whatever the Supreme Court, or lower courts for that matter, you can have nationwide injunctions just by district judges. That whatever a judge says is the law of the land. This has nothing whatsoever to do with the letter of the Constitution and what the intentions of the founding fathers were. So you're getting back to something which is more of what the founding fathers intended, and that is we have we have political rule in this country, not judicial rule, not expert rule. Political rule means that elections matter, and it means that the people get to have their say both in the legislative branch and the executive branch in terms of what's going to happen policy wise. And the courts, while they do have, opinions and they do have some limited powers, they're the weakest branch for a reason, and they were set up that way for a reason. So I think this is all very healthy, and it's very healthy. Obviously, I like a lot of what Trump is doing, but I would say even people who don't like what Trump is doing should recognize that this is actually a good thing in terms of restoring the kind of constitutional balance between the people and their governors, their leaders, that the founding fathers intended, and that's actually healthy within a republic. And what you had before this, where everyone was deferring and sort of hiding the real power behind the idea that the judiciary was supreme and that the permanent executive bureaucracy was untouchable. That was very unhealthy. That was very despotic. That was very much contrary to democracy itself. I mean, it's very ironic that Trump's critics will always say, "Oh, democracy is under threat." No, Trump is bringing democracy back, and they don't like it.
Hmm. Final question for you. I think we've seen in the past few weeks that a lot of people talk MAGA, but they might be wolves in sheep's clothing. Um, that is acutely clear in this town with the tariffs. That is clear sometimes on Capitol Hill when you're talking to folks about budget reconciliation. Um, there's a lot of folks who wish that the MAGA movement would be a flash in the pan. And Trump is thinking, as you said, along new vistas. He has grand visions, grand ambitions for the country. He's in an acquisitive mood by talking about Greenland and Canada and
Mm.
Panama and all this stuff. Um, I think there's two paths ahead of Trump broadly. I'm not really getting that specific, but one is that these agents who want to see the Trump administration fail win, and Trumpism or MAGA or the golden age or whatever you want to call it seems like a flash in the pan. And the second is that he creates something new, that it is a enduring legacy. Um, for Trump, I'm sure that he wants that latter type of legacy, one that is lasting, one that puts America on new footing. If he called you into the Oval Office and said, "Dan, how do I get there? How should I be thinking about my legacy?" What would you tell him?
I mean, the fact is, Trump, follows his own star and does it much better than any advisor has been able to do.
Mm.
Um, so I actually, there are a whole number of things I would have done differently. For example, the tariffs, I would have been much more incremental about it. I would have been much more targeted and selective. And Trump has gone for the big play. But more often than not, I have been, and this. I actually enjoy being wrong in a sense. I enjoy, saying, "Wow, I had such a limited view of what could be done, and Trump has completely expanded this." Similarly with foreign policy, that Trump, for a very long time, people like you and I who are, in favor of not just more restraint but burden sharing. That yes, we should have allies, but those allies need to be very much responsible for their domain, for their region, and their security, and they should be, paying for it. It should not all be on America's back. People like you and I have been saying this for a very long time. And oh, can we get the NATO members to get to 2%? How can we possibly, talk them into it? And Trump isn't talking them into it. He says basically, no, you're going to do it, and you're not going to do 2%. You're going to do 5%,
Mhm.
or maybe more. So Trump, in a way, he goes beyond what even people who have a Trumpian point of view in general could have predicted. And so in a way, I would want to be humble, and I would want to say, Mr. President, what are you finding frustrating right now? What do you think are the obstacles you're facing? And then I would want to kind of address how we can how I might advise overcoming those, rather than saying I'm going to steer the ship better than you will. In part because not that I think my more incremental approach wouldn't be a good one, but I just don't know if well, certainly I don't have the backing of the American people for my approach. And second, I could be wrong. I mean, I need to have that degree of humility. Maybe the president actually does know better, and he's certainly not just in his role as president, but also in his life of success as a businessman, in the cutthroat world of New York real estate, in entertainment. This is a guy who has not only succeeded in each of those fields, but oftentimes has redefined the very rules of the game being played in a successful way. So while I would have, various pieces of advice, and I would say, okay, here's the case I would make for, this more incremental approach on a variety of issues, especially on trade. And I would say, Mr. President, it definitely is a good idea to, always be the president for the nation as a whole, always give thought to that, which is not to say, there are not opponents that you should simply be willing to fight on the same terms that they're fighting you. But, do keep in mind, there are Americans who believe in free trade for good faith reasons. There are some benefits that come with, some of the fruits of globalism and fruits of neoliberalism. And we just have to be careful that we are not, again, getting kind of the worst of both worlds, where we haven't been able to move fully to a more national economy, but we have lost some of the advantages that we had from our dominant position in the more globalized international field. So all of those would be sort of nuances. I will say, going back to your earlier question about the executive orders, I think the president is wise here to realize you cannot, there's a saying, you can't bring a knife to a gunfight, right? If your opponents are using these non-constitutional powers, whether it's, abusing the courts and abusing, legal process in order to push a substantive policy of mass immigration, whether it's, concentrating power, which again is unconstitutionally a mixture of judicial, legislative, and executive, putting this in the deep state, putting this in the executive bureaucracy. If that's what your opponents are doing, you can't say, well, we're just going to do, the most formal, sort of, delicate approach. We're going to, the president's not going to do anything. He's just going to go and beg Congress, please pass a law saying all these things are bad. No, you have to be willing to play, using the tools that the Constitution gives you, which includes this power of executive orders. And it includes, frankly, some of the powers that Congress has ceded to the presidency, which, talk about, getting Congress to take its role more seriously. Well, now they have a choice, right? They gave the presidency, they gave the executive these powers thinking, okay, now presidents are going to use them to advance free trade. Well, now actually the president can use them also to advance national economy against free trade. And Congress has a choice. Now, are you going to continue to defer to the president, which you can do? Or are you going to say, well, if you don't like this, then you have to take back not only the power, but also the responsibility and the accountability. So if Congress wants to set trade policy, Congress is going to have to be answerable to its voters. And of course, that's precisely what Congress didn't want to have and why they deferred all of these trade powers to the president in the first place. They wanted to get out of the crosshairs of voters who were unhappy with even the degrees of globalization we were seeing in the early 90s, and even going back beyond that into the Cold War in the late 1980s.
Dan McCarthy, thank you for joining me on this week's episode of the Signal Sitdown.
Thanks, Bradley.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sitdown. Before you go, be sure to hit like and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review. We not only love your feedback, but it really does help the show. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works. See you next time.